So if you could take turns introducing yourselves and where you're from and what you're doing currently,
I'm Kathleen Marienau, and I am the full-time faculty of the School for New Learning at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. The School for New Learning is an adult-focused college, and I am working primarily with graduate students who are working professionals doing individually designed competency-based programs. And I also direct our Master of Arts in Educating Adults program. And I direct this initiative, Community Engagement Network, Collaborative Learning for Action. And I've been there for 35 years.
And I'm Kathleen Taylor, and I'm a professor in the School of Education of St. Mary's College of California. We are the only doctoral program in St. Mary's College. And it's titled Educational Leadership. However, we define leadership very broadly. And it's not just people who are working in formal classroom settings. We have people who work in nonprofits, who work in public and private agencies, who are consultants, and the school is committed to social change, and it's values-based, so that in some sense, the work that Catherine and I have done is absolutely perfect for the kinds of students that we are hopefully sending back out in the world.
just launch in and tell the story of how you met and how that relationship grew. That'd be great.
The tagline is, I picked her up in a bar. But the reality was it was the middle of the afternoon and neither of us was drinking. I think she'd gone in to get change for $1 or something. And I saw her there, and I had seen her do a presentation at this conference. And when I saw her, I said, I want to be her when I grow up. And seeing her there in the bar, I thought, I can talk to her now. And I just went up, and I don't know what idiotic thing I said, but we started chatting, and Catherine is always gracious. So she, here's this person accosting her in the middle of the day, but she was just charming and delightful and responsive. And that conversation actually went on for several minutes because I was enthusing about this discovery that I thought I had made in the world, that higher education changes the adults who engage with it. And gosh, it turned out that it wasn't just my experience. It turned out that there was this whole body of knowledge about that. And Catherine said, have you read Jacques Mezirow? And I said, who? So I was new to this area of learning, and that sort of was the jumping off point for all things transformative in terms of understanding theory.
So this relationship grew, and the two of you have been working together for quite a while and have quite a recent project on learning in the brain.
Right. Well, we've worked off and on ever since the mid 1980s when we first met, and we wrote a book together, and that came out in 2000 on developing adult learners, strategies for teachers and trainers. And before that, we had done some work on women's development, and we've written about self-assessment, and we've traversed a number of areas having to do with adults and adult learning. But what we're mostly interested in is learning and how learning changes and transforms a person, and hopefully groups and even maybe societies. But we'll go there later. Mm-hmm. So the book that Facilitating Learning with the Adult Brain in Mind, that started out as Kathleen's basically her idea. And at the early point, I was going to be involved mainly by contributing to connecting brain-based learning with theories in adult learning and development. Well, things evolved, and I became fully involved in the project, and very happy that I have been, because it's been, and I've been working in this area for 45 years now, and it's working on the book and on the ideas around with the neuroscience and philosophy of mind, and connecting that with learning has been, it's been so rejuvenating for me, and I've long thought that we barely, as educators, we barely scratch the surface of what learning is really about, and what it takes for someone to learn and to change. And I think we're really getting some, I think, profound insight into that. And it's still early, and so there's a lot of work to be done.
The story we tell, which is true, is that we were both busily reading in the literature about the brain and learning, to the extent that our background as non-neuroscientists made possible, but we were very interested in it. Fortunately, a whole lot of material had been written for the lay public by very serious neuroscientists. And there was a point where we discovered that we were a little bit in a quandary, because either you had a book that was so full of Latin and references that it was ponderous and overwhelming. And, you know, as an educator, I wanted to get to, okay, that's where the anterior gyrus is, but what about that? Where's the good stuff? Or, and this was also happening more or less concurrently, there was so much being done that was internet ready, meaning 10 things you can do to work with the brain. And that was just totally unsatisfying. So we kept looking for something that would take serious neuroscience and sort of translate it so that people who didn't want to read heavily into physiology and anatomy would be given enough information to serve them as practitioners, but at the same time, to take that serious information and to say, well, how does that apply? And finally, and this is really true, when we couldn't find what we were looking for, we figured we had to write it. Because by this time, we had a pretty good sense that we knew a lot of things about how this really played out in practice. And now we had the neuroscientific research to sort of confirm things that we had done on a kind of an observational, perhaps best practices method. But to be fair, we didn't know as much as we thought we did. Or more accurately, we knew a lot and we did a good job of translation. And there was a point at which we suddenly realized, wait a minute, we can't just explain why this confirms what we've been doing. We have to change what we're doing in order to really, really meet the demands of the adult brain.
Wow. What are some of those changes then that you've taken on board in your own practice?
Certainly, what we came to realize and appreciate was the power of symbols and images and movement, and all of this kind of falls under embodiment. So I think both of us would have been very comfortable leading, facilitating deep discussions, conversations for, you know, anywhere from an hour to 5 hours, and it's very discussion based, and we've, you know, been pretty effective with that. So what we had to do was really begin to try out activities that were really beyond our comfort zone. That I worked for many years with a colleague whose background is theater and improvisation, and so she was always the one, when we would do work together, who would lead these warm-up activities, or, you know, things that were actually much more experience-based in the classroom, that seemed kind of silly to me at first. But what I've learned especially is how important it is for movement and playfulness to be part of what adults like that, just like children. So adults like that. And you can really use those activities as a kind of a living metaphor for some of the ideas and concepts that to talk about later. So for me, it was a stretch, and now I look forward to every new course, see what else I can try out. And we've been using professional development workshops that we do. So we have people
I guess
actually doing some of the approaches that we feature in our book.
what the two crucial words in there are part of on the cover of our book. They're highlighted, which is embodied and analogical, which sort of sounds like, well, what's that doing there? And what's important to realize is when you understand how the adult brain in particular really works, because kids' brains are just sponges, they take everything in more or less uncritically. But by the time you're an adult, you have acquired layer after layer of, well, they're neural networks, and they tell you how the world works and what your place is in that world. And we recognize that, you know, psychology is one science that deals with these networks, and anthropology and sociology are other ways of referring to the disciplines around these networks. And as educators, we have to acknowledge that all of this is already going on in adults' brains. Yes. That said, the language that it's going on in, though it feels to us or it seems to us that it is verbal, because that's the only part of it that we can articulate and recognize. In fact, the language of the brain is analogical. It is in metaphor. It is in symbols. The way the brain actually understands the world is by saying to itself, except of course, how is this moment in time comparable to some other moment in time, based on all of the moments that I've already had and categorized according to what they mean. So the brain makes meaning by figuring how is this like that, which is what we mean by analogy. And it's embodied because everything we come to understand, and there's all sorts of people who explain this in great detail, George Lakoff among them, is based on a lifetime of experiences that we have throughout our body, not just from the neck up, and that form these networks of association that in fact tell us how the world works, and that in fact are the basis for our learning anything new. So when we as educators want to be most effective, particularly in challenging some of those existing ways of knowing and understanding, because let's face it, as adults, we have a lot of opinions about how it is, but to really learn something new and to be able to literally change your mind, it is more effective not to come at this simply through words, but through experiences that speak to the brain in this analogical and embodied way. And that was a stretch, because we're used to knowing how to talk really good. And all of a sudden, we needed to create this whole variety of experiences that help the adult's brain say, oh, well, that's different. Huh. I guess maybe I have to rethink that. Now, again, it's easy to talk as though the brain is talking, but it isn't.
Yes. And so I'm curious, what's the role of reflection in those types of experiences? So if you create an experience that is new, and the brain might be processing that perhaps on a subconscious level, what's the role of reflection in those experiential ways of learning and metaphorical and analogical ways of learning.
I think one of the things that we've learned about that is to start with the experience and then have people notice how they're feeling. How are they feeling, and where are they feeling it in their body? Where's the and that's very difficult for many people to notice what am I actually feeling? What are the feelings that are evoked for me from this particular activity, and where is it located in my body? And then to be more patient about before we really move into, oh, so what does this mean, and how does this connect to this concept or this theory, or whatever the material is that we're talking about. And I find that the students or the faculty, when we do faculty development workshops, when they're able to begin to connect feeling with the cognitive part, that is where the ahas are more likely to happen. I met with a graduate student last night, and he, because we had used our book in one of our courses, and he said he'd really been perplexed by this notion that we can't help but think metaphorically, and metaphor and analogy precede cognition, and feeling precedes cognition. And he said it was the activities that we did in class that really kind of stuck with him, that he was able to think it, reflect on, not just in the moment, but over time, so that he could better understand what the kind of changes that prompted for him.
Yeah, I want to come back to this issue about it can be very hard for people to reflect, or to reflect in the way that we're suggesting, because terrible generality, but we Westerners are not a very self-reflective culture on the whole, and we are used to thinking about reflection as a cognitive act. And in fact, the way we want people, when Kathleen points out, but okay, before you go there, let's look at how you feel. Now, it is two very prominent neuroscientists who wrote a series of articles that were variations of the title, "We Feel, Therefore We Know." And that is so counter to what Western philosophy in some sense is based on, which is Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." And so one of those neural networks, if you will, that all of us in this culture are operating in the shadow of is a 400-year-old philosopher's statement that at some level we all uncritically take in early in life. I mean, we may not even hear it, but it's part of the air we breathe. It's part of the water we swim in. And so it has been difficult for education to acknowledge that. And then, well, okay, but if I acknowledge it, what do I do with it? And so that's why we engage people in activities that are not only embodied, sometimes we have them physically do things that are analogies for the ideas that we want later to focus on, but we use a lot of symbolic, artifacts, sometimes they're images, that help people get past the, let me think about that, to a more, primitive is not a good word, a more fundamental, the more fundamental way that the brain really knows. And when people are using images as a way to get into this feeling place, that can be a stepping stone to a deeper and different kind of understanding then, okay, now let's have critical dialogue about that. Because we can have critical dialogue at a level that kind of is from here up, and that doesn't necessarily change any of our existing deep-seated neural patterns that tell us what we already know is what's really true. And you know that every time you pick up a newspaper and you talk about, you see the, what's the word I'm looking for, the controversies, where it's clear that people are simply not able to hear that which does not already conform with what they already believe.
I'm wondering if you'd like to share some of the examples of the types of analogies and metaphors that you've played with.
There's a recent one that I'm pretty fond of now, and we're still figuring out how best to help people interpret it, but it's this notion of the engine of learning. And this was Kathleen's imagination in terms of, if we think of a train of meaning making, and we tend to, educators that, usually we're really focusing on the cognitive, what the words, the language that we share. But what is the train metaphor helps us see that what's really driving the learning process is starting with all of those things that are going on internal to the individual, the feelings, the thoughts, the images, the metaphors, and that is a process that's largely invisible to the facilitator or the teacher, but it's what's driving. And Kathleen will explain this probably better, but it's the caboose is the last in the train, and that's where the meaning is actually being made, where we're able to come together and share a common language and interpret what we think is going on. Did I get that right, Kathleen?
Almost.
Almost. Almost.
I'm the more visually oriented of us, so so the engine is the part that we think is running everything, and the engine is the start of the train. It's where we are engaging in whatever the learning activities are. They're happening at the front end, and that's the engine, and that's what, to our way of thinking, makes the whole thing go. And at some level it does, because you can't get anywhere without that initial engine of learning, if you will. Then there's the long part of the train which is invisible to us. And that's what's going on in the neural networks that are connecting and reconnecting and finding new ways to associate what just happened with what has happened in some earlier time. And all this is going on absolutely without our knowing a thing about it. The importance of the caboose is where we become aware. The caboose is always the last car of the train. Well, in a sense, it is only the last car of that train of meaning where we begin to have conscious access to what we have just learned, because that's where we can finally articulate it. And until we don't know we know it, but it feels to us as though we went from experience to knowing, and we don't allow for that extended part of association that will result in new meaning that we can articulate.
And I think that brings us back to that you asked about reflection, because I think there's a tendency for educators to say, okay, here's our experience, now reflect. What does that mean? And what this metaphor of the engine suggests, let's be more patient with that process, because it does involve the affect and the cognitive as well. And so I think we've come to appreciate both the building in time, more time for the reflective process, and appreciating how difficult it is, how demanding, how taxing it is for the brain to really take in new feelings and new information. So as when we were working on the chapter in the book about theories of adult learning and development, it was some of those many of those, we're looking for the theories that are compatible with our basic translation of learning. And that's where Mesereau and the work in transformative learning has been really important, because it's one thing to say that our aim is to, whenever possible, that we do hope people will change their minds, that they'll expand their meaning making frames, and yet when we look at how so many of us approach that, I think we tend to shortcut the process and don't always appreciate how taxing it is. So I think Kathleen and I both have come to just have a deeper appreciation for celebrating when people do change their minds in some way, and really continue to be exploring ways to help them do that. It's not saying this is what they need to be thinking in the future. It's just that getting people more at ease with the process of changing.
I can't remember which step it is in Mesereau's famous, list of 10 ways of getting to transformative learning. But early on, there's this step that he identifies as may include feelings of anxiety or shame, or it's quite early on after the disorienting dilemma. And that needs to be explored deeply.
Yeah.
That is where this hidden stuff is happening, that in many cases is a challenge not just to this little piece of knowledge right now, but let's remember that we have built up this whole network of knowing and knowledge over a lifetime, and we are committed to it. We are committed to the way I understand my culture, the way I understand my place in this environment, and all the layers. We call them the Grand Canyons, the deep experiences that have affected the geography, if you will, of our knowledge and understanding. And there's nothing wrong with having done that. And that's what has made us who we are and what we're capable of. And yet, here's where we get into sort of the developmental psychologists such as Keegan. And yet, if we are to sort of transcend the understandings that we acquired in the first 3 or 4 decades of our life, that will enable us to see the world anew, that will enable us to make those new kinds of decisions that we weren't capable of making earlier. But now that's where we have the potential, for example, for social change. That's where it ceases to be only my transformation of my own experiences, and it becomes the possibility to really reach out in new directions and to imagine a future that we haven't yet experienced. Well, I'm going to just say a brief thing, and I'm sure Catherine will elaborate, but the more we get into this, the more we realize the huge implications of this. One of the areas that has recently just echoed is about, Kath, what's that phrase about assumptions about how, it's escaping me for the moment, but we are hugely captivated by our existing understandings, and we really, really need to be able to go beyond that, which is why we love doing professional development work, so that people like us who are educators, who are committed to their students and committed to change, the possibility of change, can develop new tools toward a more a more effective way of giving people choices toward commitment and community and so forth.
I think we've certainly seen the connection with Keegan's work and Mesro as well, in terms of the complexity of learning and change and navigating in the world. And I have been for many years quite focused on individual learning, individual learning and development. And more recently, I've been working with students and alums from my school who are all involved in social action efforts. And I am seeing that the use of metaphor and analogy and embodiment, when done collaboratively, is really making a difference in terms of how people are coming to understand the nature of the work that they're trying to do, and also appreciate the people with whom they're trying to provide some service. And I think that there's potential to bring this work more into group, and also looking at sort of a social change agenda, and not only focused on the individuals.
The phrase I couldn't think of was implicit bias.
Oh,
that's obviously, you know, a topic for another huge time, but that's what the brain does. I mean, we don't have to say bad and wrong. It just does that. And so now we have perhaps more tools that we can affect that. And another area that is increasingly important is coaching, and not necessarily just coaching of individuals, but the idea of coaching, which is being able to help people process whatever the issues are that they are working with, whether they're personal or professional, to create an environment within which people can better address their own desired changes and outcomes, and hopefully in ways that are not just about my particular moment in time, but the ways in which I act in my communities and in all the settings of which I am a part. And that's how we can help to support the potential for social change.
Yes.
We have big plans.
We do.
I mean, we're very excited about all sorts of possibilities. I mean, we like to speak to our international colleagues because there are these wonderful pockets of interest in expanding what we understand about the brain and learning. And for many people who just don't want to sit down and read anatomy and physiology, we feel like our capacity to translate is valuable. And not only to translate the literature, but then to add to that, okay, good. Now what do we do with that if we're practitioners? So that's where we're really excited about the work that we are laying out for ourselves.
Lovely, lovely. Well, maybe we'll end there, and I can see a series of talks.
We'll come back anytime, just
Yeah, anytime.